Heating fuel is expensive. Does a buyer have to pay the seller for the fuel in the tank? Stay tuned and I'll let you know. I'm Aaron Chadbourne from Demetria's team, the Real Estate Group, and our team has the experience to help you in any real estate transaction. This time of year, with heating fuel prices rising like crazy and the temperatures getting colder, a big consideration for most people is the cost of heating fuel. And it can mean quite a bit of money. So how much is that fuel in the tank worth? Well, if you're a seller, you may have recently filled a tank, or you're on the fence about whether you fill it now or you just go with whatever's in the tank until closing. Well, first and foremost, we want to make sure that the house doesn't lose heat during these winter months. So my advice to most sellers is fill that tank. If you have the resources to do it, it's always a good idea to make sure it's full. But then what happens in the transaction? In the purchase and sale agreement, there's a section about prorations. It talks about the different things that get prorated at the time of closing in terms of expenses and fees. It talks about taxes, talks about any association fees, utilities, those sorts of things. And one option that a buyer has is to say, I will pay the seller for the fuel in the tank or I won't. Now, this is an important part of the negotiation. If you're a buyer and you know it's going to be a competitive situation, you want to make sure you're making an aggressive offer. That seller is going to be thinking about how much money they just had to pay in order to fill their tank. For a 250-gallon tank of heating fuel, it's probably not going to be empty when it gets filled, but it's not inconceivable that someone's just spent $1,000 or more to get it full. Similarly, if there are large propane tanks or there are multiple types of heating elements, like propane for cooking, oil for heating, there might be another outbuilding that has its own heating source with its own kerosene tank. There might be multiple sources of heating fuel, which means the seller has spent a lot of money to fill those tanks, and those are real dollars. So number one, as a buyer, you want to make sure that you have the funds available if we say you're going to prorate for the fuel. Now, the fuel did cost the seller some money, and it's money that's not included in the value of the house. Your offer wasn't higher because there was a full tank of heating fuel. So if it's a competitive situation, we generally recommend to our buyers that you tell the seller, yes, I'll pay you for that valuable fuel that's in the tank. How much do you pay? Well, the way that Maine contracts read is that fuel tanks get prorated on the day of the closing, or maybe a few days before because we need to calculate it and get it on the closing statement. So that means that the realtors will take a reading of the tank. Let's say it's 5/8 of the way full, or if it's a propane tank, 35% full. We'll call the fuel supplier that most recently fueled it and get today's cash price. Right now, as I talk, we're somewhere in the mid $5 range on what it costs for a gallon of number 2 heating fuel, heating oil, the typical thing. $5 a gallon, that's a big expense. So if you have 100 gallons or 200 gallons, that's real money. If you're a seller, it's important to pay attention to what's happening to the fuel, whether it's being prorated and paid for by the buyer at closing. If that's important to you and you've put that in, we need to make sure that it's in that final contract. And when I sit down with you to go over the offers that we have in hand, I'm going to compare for you several different terms on what they've offered. We'll look at the overall asking price, we'll look at whether they're asking for inspections, we'll look at the type of financing, and we'll look at, are they paying you extra for the fuel that's in your tank? Now, if you don't have a tank, if you're on natural gas and so you just pay as you use, or if you're on all electric heat, maybe heat pumps are your primary source and you don't have a backup source of fuel, maybe you don't care about this. But if you're a seller and you've recently filled your tank, you're going to care. So we want to make sure that we know what the contract says. Now, in the event that someone's paying you asking price or maybe a little bit less, you probably want to make sure you get fully reimbursed for the fuel that's in your tank. In the event someone's paying you $5,000 or $10,000 more than asking price, or $20,000 more than asking price, or 20% more than asking price, maybe it's less relevant to your consideration because they're already paying you top dollar for the house. Maybe it's something a seller's willing to let go. But it's an important conversation to have, and it's one that we have to have at the time you're accepting an offer. Because whatever the contract says in the section on fuel prorations, in the purchase and sale agreement, which is the offer, and once you sign it and accept the offer, it turns into the contract, that's going to determine whether or not you get paid for fuel at the closing. I know it sounds simple, but for Mainers, we care a lot about our heat, and heating fuel is expensive. If you have questions about this or anything else, my team would love to talk to you about it and talk to you about how we can get you top dollar for your house in this changing real estate market. For Demetria's team, the real estate group, I'm Aaron Chadbourne.